The sound came before the darkness. A deep, chest-level concussion from somewhere down the road. Not thunder. Not a car crash. Something mechanical. Final. The kind of sound that does not echo, it just stops, and the silence after it feels heavier than the noise itself. Then the lights went out. Every single one. Not just my house. Not just my block. The entire grid sector, homes, street lamps, the HOA clubhouse glowing at the end of the road, all of it dropped to zero in under 2 seconds. I stood on my porch in the sudden dark and breathed in the air. Ozone. Burned insulation. The specific metallic smell that only comes from a transformer that has been pushed past the point of no return. I did not reach for my phone. I did not look for a flashlight. I just stood there, hands in my pockets, and let the darkness settle around me. Because I knew exactly what had just happened. I knew which transformer had blown. I knew which load sequence had triggered the cascade. I knew the precise moment 3 weeks ago when the system crossed the threshold from stress to inevitable. And I knew whose signature was on every unauthorized reroute that had built toward this moment 1 quiet amp at a time. Somewhere down the block, a car alarm was chirping in the dark. A dog was barking. Voices were calling out from open windows, confused, a little frightened, asking questions that had no comfortable answers. The HOA event was still technically in progress. Or it had been, 60 seconds ago. Tables of food. String lights. A live set just beginning its second song. Victoria Hale standing at the center of it all like she had built this neighborhood with her own hands. Now all of it sat in the same darkness as everyone else. I looked toward the transformer station visible from the corner of my street. In the distance, a faint orange glow still traced the outline of the enclosure. Not a fire. The residual heat of a system that had finally, completely, given out under a load it was never designed to carry. I had not touched a single control in the last 4 hours. I had not needed to. My name is Daniel Mercer. I have lived in this neighborhood for 11 years. To most people. Here, I am the quiet guy at the end of the lane. Middle-aged. Keeps to himself. No loud parties. No drama. Just a modest house, a driveway with 1 truck, and apparently, according to Victoria Hale, a portable generator that violated HOA aesthetic standards. That generator. That was how this started. 1 complaint. 1 letter. 1 woman deciding that her interpretation of community standards gave her the authority to reach into my property and take something that was never hers to touch. She did not ask. She did not warn me beyond a fine schedule printed on clean white paper. She just moved the line. Literally. Had someone reroute the electrical feed from my meter into the HOA distribution system, quietly, during a scheduled maintenance window, and assumed I would never understand what had been done. She did not know who she had taken from. She did not know what my house was actually connected to. She did not know that the line she had just hijacked was not a standard residential feed. It was a load-balancing node tied directly to the private grid infrastructure that powers this entire subdivision. Infrastructure that belongs, legally, contractually, exclusively, to my company. She thought she was punishing a neighbor. She had just rerouted a private grid she did not own. And tonight, 5 months later, standing in the dark with the smell of burned transformer in the air and $4.8 million in cascade damage spreading silently through 17 homes and a clubhouse full of ruined equipment, the system had simply done what overloaded systems always do. It told the truth. I turned and walked back inside. The night was just getting started. It started with a piece of equipment worth maybe $400. A portable generator. Compact. Efficient. I had used it during a planned outage 2 years prior and simply left it on the side of the driveway where it was out of the way, partially screened by a shrub, bothering no one. It did not make noise when it was not running. It did not leak. It did not smell. It sat there the way outdoor equipment sits, quietly, functionally, invisible to anyone not specifically looking for a reason to object. Victoria Hale was always specifically looking. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday. Violation notice. Exterior equipment stored in non-compliant location. Fine schedule attached. I had 30 days to remedy or face escalating penalties. The language was precise and bureaucratic in the way that HOA documents always are, designed to sound inevitable. Like the rules themselves had written the letter and Victoria was simply the messenger. I set it on my kitchen counter and went back to work. The second letter came 6 days later. Same violation. Updated fine total. A note that the board had reviewed my case and found my response, which had been no response, unsatisfactory. The tone shifted slightly. Less procedural. More personal. Words like persistent noncompliance and community standards undermined started appearing. I recognized the shift. This was no longer about the generator. This was about whether I would submit. The third letter arrived 2 days after that. This one included a photograph. Someone had stood at the edge of my property line and taken a picture of the generator against the shrub. In the letter, Victoria described it as an eyesore that degraded the visual integrity of the street. She had circled it in red marker like evidence at a trial. I set that one next to the first two and looked at the stack for a moment. 3 letters in 8 days over a generator that had not moved, made no sound, and affected no one. I had seen this pattern before. Not here, in larger systems. Corporate structures. Infrastructure negotiations. The escalation that begins with a small claim and is never really about the claim. It is about establishing a hierarchy. Finding out who will bend and who will push back. And then, once the resistance is mapped, deciding how far to push. Victoria had done this to at least 4 other homeowners in the past 2 years. I had watched it quietly from a distance. A fence panel that was 2 inches too tall. A basketball hoop left in a driveway. A garbage can visible from the street on a non-collection day. Each case followed the same arc letters. Fines. Escalation. Capitulation. The homeowner always eventually complied, and Victoria's control tightened a little more around the block. What none of them had done was simply wait. I did not respond to any of the 3 letters. What happened next was not something I expected, not in its method, though I should have. 2 weeks after the 3rd letter, I woke up to a silent house. Refrigerator off. AC dead. The specific nothing sound of a home without power. I checked the breaker. Everything was fine on my end. I checked the meter. The feed was interrupted upstream. I called the utility company. They told me there had been an infrastructure adjustment in the area and that my service had been temporarily rerouted pending a review. When I asked who had requested the review, the representative paused and said it had been submitted through the HOA management account. I hung up, sat down, and understood exactly what had just been done. Victoria Hale had not just fined me. She had reached past the property line, past the meter, and into the infrastructure itself. The employee in question held a Level 3 access authorization, the kind that allows maintenance reroutes without a secondary inspection sign-off, provided the requesting account has active HOA infrastructure credentials. Victoria had those credentials. She had applied for them 18 months earlier under a routine community improvement filing that nobody had flagged. It was not maintenance. It was a message. I walked to my garage and opened the panel. Feed still present at the entry point. Disconnect was upstream, exactly where she would have had to go to make this work. I stood there for a long time, looking at clean stable copper that led nowhere useful anymore, and I made a decision. I was not going to call a lawyer. I was not going to file a complaint. I was going to let her keep pulling. To everyone in this neighborhood, I was easy to underestimate. That was by design, but not by plan. I had not moved here intending to disappear. It just happened naturally, the way invisibility always happens to people who work in infrastructure. You build things. You maintain them. You make sure the power stays on and the systems run quietly, and because they run quietly, no one thinks about them. No one thinks about you. The lights work. The water flows. The grid balances. And the person responsible for all of it fades into the background of daily life like a utility pole, present everywhere, noticed nowhere. I bought this house 11 years ago because it was close to the regional distribution hub my company had just contracted to manage. Convenient. Nothing more. The neighborhood was clean, well maintained, and the HOA at the time was run by a retired engineer named Frank Odoms who understood infrastructure and left people alone. I moved in, set up my home office, and settled into the kind of quiet working life that does not attract attention. Frank retired 4 years ago. Victoria Hale ran unopposed. Within 6 months, the culture of the neighborhood had shifted in ways that are difficult to name precisely but easy to feel. Small things. The tone of the newsletter. The way violations were issued. The increasing specificity of the rules and the decreasing tolerance for anything that existed outside them. It was the particular energy of someone who had waited a long time for authority and was not going to waste a moment of it. I watched it from a distance, and noted it the way I noted other system changes. Data point. Pattern. No immediate action required. What no one in this neighborhood knew, not Victoria, not the board, not the families who had lived here for decades, was what my company actually did. The name on my mailbox was Mercer. The company registered at this address was listed as a grid infrastructure consultancy. Technically accurate. Strategically vague. The full name, for anyone who looked carefully enough through the Utility Commission filings, was Mercer Grid Systems LLC. And Mercer Grid Systems held the private infrastructure contract for this entire subdivision, the 340-home planned community built in 2003 on top of an independent distribution network that was never absorbed into the main municipal grid. A private grid. Deeded infrastructure. Maintained, managed, and legally owned by my company through a contract that renewed automatically every 5 years and had never once been contested. Most homeowners did not know this because most homeowners never looked at the Utility Commission filings. They paid their HOA fees. They paid their power bills. The lights stayed on. They asked no further questions. Victoria Hale certainly never asked. She saw a middle-aged man who lived alone, drove a truck, left a generator on his driveway, and did not attend HOA meetings. She saw someone who had no obvious leverage, no obvious allies, and no obvious understanding of the administrative machinery she had spent 4 years building. She saw a target. What she missed was the infrastructure. My house sits on the corner of Linwood and Crestview. It is not the largest house on the block. It does not have the most visible landscaping. But beneath it, buried in the utility easement that runs along the western edge of my property, runs the primary load balancing node for Grid Sector 7, the distribution point that manages power flow for all 340 homes, the clubhouse, the shared amenities, and as of 18 months ago, the new EV charging infrastructure Victoria had approved as a community benefit. All of it ran through my property. She had not stolen power from a neighbor. She had rerouted the load balancing spine of a private grid she did not own, did not understand, and had no legal right to touch. And for 5 months, I let her believe she had won. Because the quietest kind of power is the kind that does not need to announce itself. It just runs. Steady. Patient. Beneath everything. Until the moment it does not. By the end of the 2nd month, the numbers had become almost impressive. I do not mean that as a compliment. I mean that the scale of what Victoria had constructed on top of a system she did not own had reached a point that required a specific kind of organizational commitment. This was not casual theft. This was infrastructure expansion built on deliberate ignorance. It started with my line. When the reroute went through, my residential feed, which was also the auxiliary input for the Sector 7 load balancing node, got quietly redirected into the HOA shared distribution network. On paper, it looked like my house had gone dark due to a service interruption. In practice, my line was still live. It was just no longer serving my house. It was serving everyone else's. I confirmed this in the 3rd week by driving the service road behind the subdivision and standing outside the transformer enclosure with a frequency analyzer I had pulled from my field kit. Same harmonic signature as the node beneath my property. Same load pattern I had been logging from inside my garage. My line was carrying approximately 22% of total neighborhood demand and routing it through the HOA common systems. By month 2, it was 30%. Victoria had not stopped at redirecting my line. She had used the additional capacity to authorize 3 new additions to the HOA electrical infrastructure. First, a permanent lighting upgrade to the clubhouse patio, doubling the fixture count and adding programmable RGB strips along the roofline. Second, 2 additional EV charging pedestals in the guest parking area, each rated for 48 amp service. Third, and this was the one that told me everything I needed to know about her awareness of what she was doing, a dedicated 240-volt circuit run from the HOA panel directly to the reserved parking space outside her home. Her Tesla was no longer sharing a residential circuit with her house. It was pulling from the HOA infrastructure. The infrastructure that was pulling from my node. The node I owned. Every night, at approximately 10:15 p.m., the load signature from that circuit would ramp up smoothly, the specific draw profile of a long-range Tesla beginning a full charge cycle. 32 amps. Sometimes 40 when the battery was significantly depleted after her weekend events. I logged it every night. Same time. Same curve. Confident. Uninterrupted. Like a machine that had never been told it was drawing from something it had no right to. I started keeping 2 sets of records. The first was the technical log, voltage readings, load percentages, timing data, harmonic analysis. Timestamped, precise, formatted to Utility Commission standards. The second was a separate document I thought of as the liability map. Every unauthorized connection. Every undocumented load addition. Every instance of HOA infrastructure drawing from a node that belonged to Mercer Grid. Systems without a contract, without a billing arrangement, and without disclosure to the homeowners whose fees were supposedly funding this expansion. The liability map grew faster than I expected. By month 3, Victoria had also approved the installation of an outdoor sound system for the clubhouse, 6 weatherproof speakers on independent amplifiers, all running off the common panel. She had upgraded the pool pump to a variable speed commercial unit that drew significantly more during peak temperature periods. She had added exterior heaters along the patio for cooler evenings. And she had quietly extended the common lighting to include a new pathway system running the full length of the neighborhood's central walking trail. None of it had been disclosed to homeowners as a cost line. None of it had been disclosed to anyone as drawing from private infrastructure. None of it had gone through the Utility Commission. She had built an expanding energy system on top of a node she had never been authorized to touch, funded it invisibly through an undisclosed reroute, and presented the results to the neighborhood as evidence of her effective management. The clubhouse looked better than it ever had. The trails were beautifully lit. The EV infrastructure was modern and expanding. Victoria Hale was, by all visible measures, delivering. What she was actually delivering was exposure. Because every addition she made increased the load on a system that had a physical limit. Every new circuit was another variable in a load balance that was already running without its designed input. And the further she pushed the expansion, the less margin remained between steady operation and the kind of failure that does not announce itself with warnings. It announces itself with a sound. A specific, final, mechanical sound. I had heard it before, in 3 different grid sectors over my career. I knew exactly what it sounded like when a transformer gave out under sustained overload. I just needed to make sure the conditions were right. Let me explain what my house actually is. Not the structure. The structure is unremarkable. 3 bedrooms, a 2-car garage, a concrete patio I have never bothered to furnish properly. What matters is what runs beneath it. In 2003, when Crestview Commons was developed, the builder made a decision that was common for large planned subdivisions at the time. Rather than connecting to the municipal grid at standard residential tariff rates, they constructed an independent distribution network and contracted private grid management. The economics made sense at scale. 340 homes drawing from a centralized private node could negotiate wholesale energy rates, maintain their own infrastructure standards, and in theory operate more efficiently than standard residential service. The builder contracted a company called Harman Utilities Group. Harman ran the grid for 4 years, then sold their infrastructure contracts portfolio in 2009. The buyer was a smaller firm assembling regional grid assets. That firm was absorbed in 2014 by a holding company that reorganized its assets in 2017. I was the reorganization. When I formed Mercer Grid Systems, the Crestview Commons infrastructure contract was one of 11 regional assets I acquired through that process. It was not the largest. It was not the most complex. But it was the one I chose to base myself near, because the Sector 7 node, the load balancing controller buried in the easement beneath my corner lot, was the one that needed the most attention. Old hardware. Underdocumented. Running on tolerance margins that made me uncomfortable. So I bought the house on the corner. I moved in. I upgraded the node hardware over 2 years, quietly, through the utility easement access I held under the contract. I brought the system up to current standards. And then I settled in and ran it the way I ran all my grid assets, competently, invisibly, and entirely within the terms of the infrastructure agreement that every homeowner in Crestview Commons had agreed to when they signed their purchase contract. That agreement, buried in Section 14 of the HOA covenants and 3 times cross-referenced in the title documentation, stated the following: all electrical distribution infrastructure within the boundaries of Crestview Commons is privately owned and managed under exclusive contract. Unauthorized modification, rerouting, or connection to primary or auxiliary distribution nodes constitutes a material breach of infrastructure agreement and creates personal liability for all associated damages. Section 14. 3 cross-references. Right there in the documents every homeowner signs. Victoria Hale had signed those documents. She had then, for years later, instructed someone to reroute my auxiliary node input into the HOA common distribution system without reading what she had signed, without consulting the utility commission, without contacting my company, and without, as far as I could determine, a single moment of consideration for what the line she was moving actually connected to. She thought she was redirecting a residential feed. She had rerouted the load balancing spine of a private grid. And under Section 14, every amp that had flowed through that unauthorized connection from the moment of reroute to the moment of failure was a billable liability. Not at residential rates. At private grid infrastructure rates, which include operational costs, system stress compensation, and a damage multiplier for unauthorized access events. I had run the preliminary numbers in month 2. At current draw rates, the unauthorized usage was accruing at approximately $4,200 per day. Over 5 months, that was already over $600,000 before the event damage. I had not sent a single invoice. I had not filed a single complaint. I had not made a single call to the utility commission. I had simply kept the logs. Timestamped. Formatted. Backed up to 3 separate servers. And I had waited for Victoria to keep building. Because the bigger the system she constructed on top of what she did not own, the larger the liability when the system finally told the truth about who owned it. I want to be precise about what I did and what I did not do. I did not sabotage the grid. I did not introduce a foreign load. I did not hack a system, bypass a safety control, or take any action that violated the operating parameters written into the Crestview Commons infrastructure contract. What I did was configure the system to operate exactly as designed. That distinction matters legally. It also matters practically, because the difference between attacking a system and simply removing its hidden compensations is the difference between a criminal act and an engineering decision. One creates liability for me. The other creates liability for whoever built the unstable structure I was quietly correcting. Here is what I actually changed. Since the unauthorized reroute 5 months earlier, my load balancing node had been running in a modified state, compensating, automatically, for the irregular draw being introduced by the HOA's unauthorized connections. The node was designed to do this. It was part of its function. When load comes in from an unexpected direction, the balancing system adjusts. It absorbs the irregularity. It smooths the output. It makes an unstable input look stable on the downstream side. In other words, my node had been protecting Victoria's unauthorized infrastructure from its own instability since the day she plugged into it. Without that compensation, the erratic draw patterns from the HOA's ad hoc wiring, the multiple high-amp EV chargers, the commercial pool pump, the expanded lighting, the speaker system, all of it wired without load calculation or proper sequencing, would have been visible as dangerous fluctuations in the distribution system. Safety systems would have flagged them. An engineer would have been called. The unauthorized connections would have been discovered and removed. The compensation had hidden all of that. All I did, on the afternoon of the HOA community night, was disable the compensation routine. I accessed the node control interface through my authorized maintenance terminal. I navigated to the load compensation configuration. I set the auxiliary correction value to 0. I saved the change. I logged the change, with timestamp and technical justification. Compensation routine disabled per standard operating parameters for scheduled load audit. All systems operating within contractual tolerances. That was it. That was the entire action. What it meant in practice was that the load balancing node would now operate as it was designed to operate, accepting input, distributing it, and passing along any fluctuations it received rather than absorbing them. A correctly functioning system. No overrides. No manipulation. Just the grid, running as designed, without the invisible correction layer that had been masking 5 months of unauthorized load mismanagement. Then I went home and waited. Victoria had sent the community night email 3 days earlier. Outdoor dinner. Live music. Full lighting package. She had also, according to the load projections I had run that morning, added 2 temporary generator feeds to the HOA event setup, but routed them through the common panel rather than running them independently. Which meant they would add to the draw rather than supplement it. Which meant peak demand that night would exceed anything the system had seen since the EV expansion. The temperature that afternoon was 94 degrees. Every AC unit in the neighborhood had been running at high demand since noon. The system was already at 87% of rated capacity before the event began. Without the compensation routine absorbing the irregularities, every fluctuation from that point forward would pass directly into the distribution chain. Every poorly sequenced load spike from the unauthorized wiring. Every demand surge from the event setup. Every amp that Victoria's Tesla pulled from the HOA panel connected to my node. All of it, finally, running as designed. I poured a glass of water, sat down in my kitchen, and opened my laptop to the monitoring dashboard. The logs were going to be very, very clean. The event started at 7. By 7:45, the first fluctuation logged. Not visible yet. Not to anyone outside. A 3% load variance passing through the distribution chain, flagged by the monitoring system, resolved within 2 seconds as the downstream infrastructure absorbed it. Normal behavior for a system running without compensation. A small tremor that would become a pattern. I watched the dashboard. Numbers. Percentages. Load curves climbing in the gradual, certain way that pre-failure escalation always moves. Not fast. That is the part people never understand about grid failure. It does not arrive quickly. It builds across hours. Sometimes days, compressing the tolerance margins by fractions until the fractions run out. Outside, the event was at full swing. I could hear the music from my living room, a 3-piece band Victoria had hired, running through a PA system drawing an estimated 2.4 kilowatts off the clubhouse panel. String lights. Outdoor heaters. The fountain running, the pool running, the refrigeration units in the clubhouse kitchen running. 60-plus people in attendance, several of them with electric vehicles now connected to the guest charging pedestals. 8:12 p.m. Load at 91%. The first visible flicker hit at 8:23. A brief dimming across the patio lights. Most people would not have noticed. The band did not stop. Conversations continued. Someone glanced up and looked back down. I noted the timestamp. 8:41 p.m. Load at 94%. The compensation-free node was now passing fluctuations cleanly into the distribution chain. The downstream infrastructure was absorbing what it could and flagging what it could not. Every unauthorized circuit in the HOA setup was pulling inconsistently, the exact load profile you get from wiring that was never calculated for sequence demand. The second visible flicker came at 8:55. This one lasted almost 2 seconds. The music cut momentarily before the system restabilized. Outside, I could hear a pause in conversations. A few voices. Then the noise resumed. 9:07 p.m. Load at 97%. 3% of margin left. In a properly maintained system running authorized loads, that margin holds. Systems are built with tolerance for peak demand. But the tolerance is calculated on the assumption that the loads are known, documented, and sequenced according to engineering spec. Victoria's additions had never been calculated. They had been added one by one, over 18 months, by someone who looked at a panel and saw available space rather than physical limits. 9:19 p.m. Load at 99.3%. I set down my glass. The third fluctuation rolled through the entire block simultaneously. Not just the event, every house, every street lamp, every active circuit on the Sector 7 distribution network. A full sector event. 2 seconds of reduced output followed by an uneven recovery. Half the street came back to full brightness. The other half stabilized at roughly 80%. Outside, I could hear it now. Voices at a different pitch. Doors opening. People stepping onto driveways. 9:23 p.m. The monitoring dashboard flagged it before the sound reached me. Transformer Station 7C. Sustained overload condition. Protective systems activating, but the relay configuration on 7C had been set to delayed trip during the last maintenance cycle, a legacy setting from the original 2003 installation that I had flagged for update and not yet corrected. Under normal compensation, it never mattered. Without it, the delay gave the overload exactly the window it needed. The sound that came next was the one I had described at the opening of this story. A deep, structural concussion. Not sharp. Not a crack. A low, terminal boom that moved through the air and the ground simultaneously. The sound of something very large and very well engineered finally being asked to do more than it was built for. Then silence. Then darkness. Then the smell of ozone and burned insulation moving through the summer air. I sat in my kitchen for a long moment. The monitoring dashboard was still running on backup power. The logs were recording, timestamped clean. Total event duration from first fluctuation to transformer failure, 1 hour, 31 minutes. Every second of it documented. Every load reading logged. Every unauthorized draw recorded against the specific HOA circuits that had been operating without authorization for 5 months. I closed the laptop. Went to bed. The lawyers would handle the morning. The Utility Commission report took 11 days. I had seen the preliminary numbers before it was filed, but reading them in an official document has a different weight. Transformer Station 7C, total failure. Replacement cost $340,000. Estimated restoration timeline, 6 to 8 weeks, during which all 340 homes in Crestview Commons would operate on temporary utility hookups at significantly degraded capacity. Downstream equipment damage from the cascade, assessed across the affected homes and shared infrastructure. 17 electric vehicles with charging systems damaged. Beyond repair. Total replacement value $1.2 million. 12 homes with fried appliances, HVAC units, and home electronics. Total assessed at $890,000. The HOA clubhouse itself, commercial refrigeration system destroyed, PA and lighting system destroyed, pool pump controller destroyed, $180,000. The HOA's own insurance carrier responded to the claim within a week. Their response was a single letter. Denial. The basis: unauthorized modification of private grid infrastructure voided coverage for all related damages. The specific clause cited was standard in commercial infrastructure policies. If the loss arose from unauthorized connection to or modification of a privately owned distribution network, the insurer bore no liability. Section 14 of the Crestview Commons HOA covenants was attached as Exhibit A. The Utility Commission investigation ran parallel to the insurance process. Their engineers traced the cascade to its origin point within 4 days. The load sequence was documented in my monitoring logs, which I provided voluntarily as the infrastructure contract holder. The unauthorized reroute, the undisclosed HOA additions, the load balancing compensation that had been masking the instability, all of it was in the data. Clear. Timestamped. Unambiguous. The Commission's finding, the transformer failure was the direct result of sustained unauthorized load introduction into a private grid distribution node, in violation of the infrastructure agreement governing Crestview Commons. Primary responsible party, Victoria Hale, in her capacity as HOA president, for authorizing the initial reroute and all subsequent load additions. Secondary findings included referrals to the contractor who had performed the physical reroute and to the utility company employee who had processed the maintenance authorization without verifying infrastructure ownership. Total assessed liability attached to the HOA account, $4.8 million, inclusive of transformer replacement, equipment damages, Mercer Grid Systems operational losses during the outage period, and the 5 months of unauthorized infrastructure usage billed at private grid rates. Victoria Hale's personal assets were listed as a contributing source of recovery. Under the Commission's finding, her liability did not arise from her role as board president, it arose from her individual act of directing the contractor to perform the reroute without board vote, without legal review, and without disclosure to homeowners. The Commission classified this as a unilateral unauthorized act, not a board decision, which meant the HOA entity's liability shield did not extend to cover her personally. Her legal counsel sent 3 letters in 4 days. My legal team responded to each one with the same document, the Commission report, the infrastructure contract, and the monitoring logs. There was nothing to negotiate. The record was complete. The 17 EV owners, including, for the record, the owners of the other 16 vehicles that had been charging from Victoria's unauthorized guest pedestals on the night of the event, were referred to the HOA's depleted accounts for recovery. The accounts covered approximately 12 cents on the dollar before they were exhausted. The remainder became personal liability. Victoria Hale's Tesla was, of course, among the 17 vehicles with a destroyed charging system. The vehicle itself was fine. But the onboard charging controller, damaged by the surge during the cascade, required full replacement. Cost, $6,800. I did not file a separate claim for it. The Commission report covered it adequately. The final HOA board meeting of Crestview Commons was held on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the transformer failure. Attendance was, for the first time in 4 years, standing room only. I arrived early. Found a seat in the second row. Set a folder on the table in front of me and did not open it. Victoria Hale took her seat at the front of the room as she always had. Her posture was precise. Her expression was controlled. Whatever she was feeling, she had decided not to show it in this room, in front of these people. I noted that and found it neither impressive nor relevant. The meeting opened with financial disclosures. The HOA accounts, the insurance denial, the Commission liability assessment, the legal fees already accumulated, were presented by the treasurer in a voice that made clear she would rather be anywhere else. When the total liability figure was read aloud, the room was quiet for a long moment. Then it was not quiet. I let the conversation run. Questions, accusations, competing theories about what had happened and who was responsible. Victoria spoke twice, briefly, to say that the situation was under legal review and that she was not in a position to comment on specifics. Both times, the room responded with a particular kind of silence that is harder to endure than shouting. When the chair opened the floor for additional items, I raised my hand. I stood, picked up the folder, and walked to the front of the room. I set it on the table in front of Victoria. Inside was a single document, a revised infrastructure services agreement between Crestview Commons HOA and Mercer Grid Systems LLC. New terms. Transparent pricing. Full disclosure of the private grid architecture to all homeowners. A dispute resolution process. And a clause, written clearly in Section 3, acknowledging the unauthorized modification event of the preceding 5 months and establishing the liability framework that the Commission had already confirmed. I looked at Victoria Hale. You weren't stealing power from a neighbor, I said. You were rerouting a private grid I own. She looked at the document. She looked at me. She said nothing. I did not need her to. I turned and addressed the room. I explained briefly and without drama what Mercer Grid Systems was, what the infrastructure contract covered, what Section 14 of their own HOA covenants said, what the Commission had found, and what the path forward looked like for 340 families who needed their power restored and their grid properly managed under terms they could actually read and understand. The questions that followed were sharp, fair, and entirely reasonable. I answered every one of them. I watched her go. No satisfaction in it. No particular feeling at all. She had made a decision 5 months ago that she did not understand the consequences of, and now she was living them. That is not a story about cruelty. It is a story about infrastructure. You either understand what you are connected to, or you find out the hard way what it does when you pull the wrong line. The remaining board members voted to accept the revised infrastructure agreement in principle, pending homeowner review. 40 minutes later, the HOA was formally dissolved by member vote 2 weeks after that. A new homeowners association was established under a transparent governance charter with full infrastructure disclosure. The grid restoration completed on schedule. I moved back into my house on a Tuesday. Reconnected my generator, properly permitted, within spec, documented in full. Set it on the same driveway where this had all started. Nobody sent me a letter. The grid ran steady that night. Quiet. Balanced. The way it was designed to. I sat on the porch and listened to it hum. Some systems do not need to be fought. They just need to be understood by the person who owns them. I didn't shut them down. The system did. They pulled the switch. I owned the grid. Daniel Mercer.